Right. Thank you very much for coming. That's the first thing. Is there anyone here who's never been to one of our Skeptics meetings before? Right, okay. Nice to see you. We'll send somebody around to collect your email addresses in case you would like to be on our mailing list in future for our forthcoming event. The message is that it's right down the bottom of our poster here. Respect people, challenge ideas. This is the motto of not only Worthing but all skeptics everywhere. So I know we've never had, this is Worthing, we're a tolerant sort of, gentle sort of society, so we've never had any difficulty, but I'd just like to draw that to your attention, especially if you've not been before. Now, tonight we have two presentations. First of all, we have Brian Edwards, who has kindly joined us. He'll tell you more about him. So I'll leave him to describe his heritage. Okay? And then I shall follow up with a response to Brian's presentation, which is on the Bible, an authentic book. Okay? Brian.
Well, good evening to you. The first thing I want to say is a very real thank you for inviting me. I mean this sincerely when I say I count it a privilege to be here among you all. Second thing I want to lay down is exactly what I'm aiming to do this evening, lest anyone should misunderstand. I happen to believe, because I'm a committed Christian, that the Bible is God's word, it is His revelation, it is without error, and it is valuable and relevant today because it leads us always on to our Lord Jesus Christ. But actually, what I want to do this evening is not to be proving that, but simply to be demonstrating that the Bible is, as the title says, an authentic book. It speaks reliably, it speaks as a book of history. You can trust its history. And in a sense, that's the narrow band that I'm talking about. So let's remember that. I was speaking once at a sixth form, and one of the guys came in very late, had no idea what I was doing, and at the end complained because I hadn't proved God. I said, if you'd been here at the beginning, you'd know I never set out to prove God. The subject was completely different. So now you know. The other thing is, I am going to limit my area to the New Testament, and particularly, though not only, to the four Gospels, because the Bible is a huge book. It covers a wide area of history, and I thought it might be easier for us to focus down. So that's my remit for myself this evening. The Bible, an authentic book. I want to begin with a quotation from the Bible. It's from John, right at the end of his Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things that he wrote, and if every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Two things I just want to pick out there. First of all, John says, we know that his testimony is true. You will say that is just simply self-authentication. You're right, it is. But as we'll see later, we have to decide whether this man's testimony can be relied upon or not. The other thing is, do remember that in the four Gospels, we only probably have 1,000th part of all that Jesus did and said in the 3 years of his public ministry. There's a great deal more that would have been written and would have been, or rather would have been said and would have been done. That's 1,000th part. I can give you the reason why I use that particular figure if you want to later. So here we go. If the Bible is a reliable and authentic book, it will show all the hallmarks of being so. I'm going to introduce you to two people this evening. Here's the first one. Simon Greenleaf was actually one of the founders, one of the co-founders of Harvard Law School back in the 19th century. He wrote a massive 3-volume treatise on the law of evidence, and it's still a classic in American law even today. But he moved his focus also onto the four Gospels, and he analysed them under the title of The Trustworthiness of the Gospels. He was a bit longer than that in the 19th century, but that was part of the title. And he gave 5 particular rules for evidence. I want you to watch these carefully and see whether you agree with them. The first evidence of witnesses is that documents have a right to be taken as a true record unless proven otherwise. This is actually something, these 5 are what he would say would stand up in any court of law, whether in America or in what is today the United Kingdom. Secondly, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy unless proven otherwise. Thirdly, the number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. Fourthly, the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. And fifthly, their reliability is confirmed if their details match known events. Now, if you look at those 5, I think you will agree that that is reasonable. That is what you expect in a court of law. If you write a letter and it has to come up into a legal case, you expect that letter to be accepted as your letter and what you believe, unless it is proven otherwise. Now, if you put the 4 Gospels into that mix, they have never been proven inaccurate. That's something I'm going to try and demonstrate by pulling out a few illustrations. You can challenge that later. Secondly, the writers were known men of integrity. We know a little bit about some of these men in tradition after the Bible. That's not biblical authority, and you can take or leave the tradition, but nothing we ever know about these men contravenes that statement. Thirdly, there are 4 independent Gospels. The evidence of that is that they don't all tell every story in exactly the same way. They clearly weren't just simply slavishly copying one original. At no point do they contradict each other. You may question that, and you have every right to, and I'll defend that in just a moment. And thirdly, fifthly, their reliability is confirmed if their details match known events. The historical events of the New Testament is confirmed by known history. It's actually true of the Old Testament. I mustn't get into that. That's not my subject. But I'm happy to answer questions later on the Old or the New. Let me just run through a few things that I think will help us in the right direction. I want to speak about literacy in the 1st century, because a lot of people have this idea that the 4 Gospels, some of you may have been brought up on this diet, that it was all Chinese whispers, oral passing on from one to another for, probably 20, 30, 40, 50. And some used to say, well, the Gospels weren't written down until about 150 years after the events. That is really old baggage now, because not many people accept that. Because one thing we do know is that the Jews, and remember all the disciples of Christ were Jews, they considered the written word final and authoritative. They had the Torah, the law, and the written word was very important to them. It's inconceivable that this great rabbi Jesus, who mattered so much to them, nobody would think of writing down anything that he said. Every Jewish male was literate. Sorry, ladies, but that wasn't your privilege. But every Jewish boy had to read and write. That was all for all of them. We know that the students of rabbis and philosophers kept notes. We have many of those notes. Civil servants and others used notebooks. Matthew, one of the Gospel writers, was an accountant. He's a tax collector in the Bible. And so was the little guy who some of you may remember went up a tree to look at Jesus, Zacchaeus. He was also a tax collector. He would have been able to read and write and fill the books at the same time. People were reading plays and poems and philosophy and history and even agricultural practice. There was a lot of reading and writing going on in the 1st century. In fact, this lovely picture of the baker and his wife, Terentius Nero, from Pompeii, the city that was covered by Vesuvius in AD 79. On their wall of their bakery, they had this lovely picture of themselves, but they want you to know we're not just any old bakers, we are educated people. She is carrying a writing tablet and he has a scroll in his hand. Very significant, that little detail. So bear that in mind. People were writing. People would have written down the stuff about this rabbi up on the hills. They would have been writing it at that time. And then I want to speak a little bit about authentic history. The whole Bible from beginning to end is rooted in history. Luke, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the Gospel writer and the author of the Acts of the Apostles as well, is recognized as an accurate historian. All studies of his Gospel and Acts comes to that conclusion. Now here's something that I think is interesting, because if you trawl the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, you'll come up with these quite incredible statistics. He refers to 117 living people by name, many of those known to history. Not all, because they were people in the small circle and they've long since disappeared from history. But many of them are historic figures. 114 towns, provinces, islands and seas and other identifiable places, none of which are out of place and wrong. 25 political, military, social or religious events. Now all of these are known in history. He refers to the famine across Judea that's referred to in Acts 11, and also the expulsion of the Jews from Rome in Acts 18. Both are found in first century texts. He was an extremely accurate historian, and he was happy for readers to check him out. I want to suggest to you that Luke, in all his travels, kept a notebook and wrote things down. And if you think that's startling, I'll show you why in just a moment. Luke's detailed accuracy is seen in a number of areas. His knowledge of Roman administration, censuses and regimental duties. Roman historians, military Roman historians, have said he's got it right on. He doesn't miss a beat on understanding the Roman administration. His knowledge of the titles of local magistrates. You see, we have in every town in the UK, we've got a thing called the town council. It's a bit boring because they're all called the same. That was not the same across Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, the land of the Acts of the Apostles. Every town council had a different name. In Philippi they were the Stratiodai, in Ephesus they were the Asiarchs, in Thessalonica they were the Politarchs, and we know that from external history. Luke gets every one of them right. He doesn't just give them blandly the same name. His geographical accuracy is right. And I love the fact that even the detailed description of Paul's shipwreck, Paul was taken as a prisoner to Rome. He went from Jerusalem, Caesarea actually, and he was taken from Caesarea to Rome by ship under guard. And the details of the shipwreck are there in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, believe it or not, there's a guy who for 30 years was at sea in the 19th century, and he wrote a book, 370 pages. James Smith, it was, The Voyage and Shipwreck of Paul. He studied it from every conceivable angle, and this was his conclusion. No sailor, he says, would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. Luke wasn't a sailor, he was a physician. However, no man not a sailor could have written a narrative of a sea voyage so consistent in all its parts and less from actual observation. This peculiarity of style is to me in itself a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by an eyewitness. A similar remark may be made of the geographical details. They must have been taken, he says, from an actual observation, because the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. Luke was known and is known today as a very accurate historian. I said earlier he must have used a notebook. First century notebook? Well, here's a first century notebook. Now here's a good idea. Take a few slithers of wood, very, very thin, or if you will, a few slithers of paper, and punch a couple of holes in the bottom and put a little ring in them. And we've made let's call it a ring binder. First century Filofax, if any of you can remember such a thing. And this new piece of technology, the Greeks didn't really have a word for. So they nicked the Latin word membrane, and it is actually called a membrane. People were using notebooks. In fact, when Paul wrote to Timothy, probably the last letter he ever wrote before his execution, he asked Timothy to bring some of his stuff to him when he comes. And he said, and don't forget the parchment, the scrolls, the obvious what they were, and the parchments, that's the translation that most have. Actually, the word parchments is the word membrane Paul was using, a notebook. I mentioned Luke's accuracy, and I mentioned also that the leaders in Thessalonica were called polytarchs. Now, they weren't called polytarchs forever, certainly not today, but they were for a century or two around the time of the Acts of the Apostles. And on this particular stone, it's a 2nd century stone found in Thessalonica, the very first word in Greek is polytarchunton, which is the people serving as polytarchs, demonstrating that Luke got it exactly right when in the Acts chapter 17 he uses that word. And when Paul and Barnabas, with Luke in tow, arrived on the Isle of Cyprus and they went to Paphos, he mentions that Sergius Paulus was the governor. He says he was an intelligent man and he was the proconsul at Paphos. And an inscription, you're looking at it here, discovered in 1877 near Paphos on Cyprus, declares that Sergius Paulus was the Roman proconsul in AD 47, exactly the time when Paul and Barnabas would have been there. Let me introduce you to the second guy this evening, and the only one of the two the only other one that I want to introduce you to, Sir William Ramsay. Now, I've depicted him rather like that because he was a bucket and spade archaeologist. He went around Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, the land of Acts of the Apostles, digging around. And when he went to Germany to begin his studies, he was told that when you begin to study the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, you will find that Luke is wrong everywhere. It will be a nonsense history. Well, he was quite a bright guy, as you will see from this. Just cast your eyes down there. I won't even bother to read them all to you. But he was knighted in 1906 for his services to archaeology, and his work has never really been succeeded because although some of it's been refined, his basic conclusions stand today. And this is what it was. And remember where he started. He expected to find Luke wrong everywhere. He said, "You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment." He added, "Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it." Now do remember what my purpose is this evening. If the New Testament is found to be an accurate record of history wherever it can be checked against contemporary records, we may accept its accuracy everywhere unless or until irrefutable proof can be shown to the contrary. In other words, the ball is on the other foot. It is not necessary for me to defend the truth of everything, because I can say where it can be checked, it is proven true. In a court of law, the document stands until it is proven false. Now, the four Gospels were complete and circulating well before the close of the 1st century. Church leaders, Clement, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, all before the end of the 1st century, all claimed that there were only four Gospels. Now, there were other false Gospels written. I can't talk about that later if you want to. But there were only four ever accepted by the churches across the Roman Empire and beyond. In fact, Irenaeus had a rather interesting way of proving that, which neither you nor I would necessarily see as proof, but it makes its point. Just as there are four zones of the world and four winds, so there can only be four Gospels. Now, not particularly strong reasoning, but it demonstrates that he was quite convinced, as all the others were, that there were only those four Gospels. And they were, in fact, they were evidences of eyewitnesses. I'll just quickly run through these. You can read them from the screen yourself, because they are really demonstrating that the Gospels claim, and the writers of the Gospels claim to be eyewitnesses. You have to prove them false, otherwise their claim stands. Let me give you just 2 or 3 instances where I believe the New Testament speaks very clearly as an authentic record. I need to explain this one, but look at it first. Philip was one of the first disciples of Christ, and he went out immediately and he got hold of a guy called Nathanael and said to him, we found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Now, imagine you're making up that story towards the end, well, let's put it as early as towards the end of the 1st century. You would not say Jesus of Nazareth, because that proved nothing. Nazareth is not even mentioned in the Old Testament, and it certainly didn't come anywhere in the Jewish expectation of their Messiah. But Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, he lived his teenage years in Nazareth, but Bethlehem, where he was born, did appear. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, 500 years before he was born, declares that Bethlehem would be the place the Messiah would be born. And the Jews always looked forward to Bethlehem as the place where their Messiah would be born. So you would surely write that Philip said to Nathanael, Jesus of Bethlehem. You know, he's the one that Moses and the prophets spoke about. And then son of Joseph. Well, Joseph was his legal father, but well before the end of the turn of the 1st century, the Christian church knew that actually he was the Son of God. And you would have said, Jesus of Bethlehem, Son of God. Ah, got it. Yeah, that's right. Why did he say Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph? Well, because that was right at the very beginning. That is all that Philip knew. And that's the mark of an authentic book. It was written at the time, very early on. And here's a strange little thing. Even if you're familiar with your New Testament, most Christians miss this bit and they don't even see it. Towards the end, Jesus is on trial. He's in the high priest's court. And Simon Peter and the Apostle John, who wrote this account, actually tried to get into the court. John writes, Simon Peter and another disciple, that's John, were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside. He didn't have an ID, he didn't have a passport. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl at duty there, and brought Peter in. Now think about that for a moment. High priest, he's the big boss in Jerusalem. He's the most important religious man in Jerusalem. How is a Galilee fisherman, how is he known by the high priest in Jerusalem? I have no idea. Maybe he delivered fish to him on a Friday. I don't know. We just don't know how he knew him. So why put that in? It makes no sense. It answers no questions. It just raises questions. It doesn't answer any. He put it in because it was his story, and he knew he was known to the high priest for whatever reason. He knew he could just walk in because he was known. Peter couldn't. He was stopped at the door. He had to go back and say to the boat, "It's okay, he's with me." You know the kind of setup. Here's another one. Jesus writing in the sand. Do you remember the account of the woman that was taken in the act of adultery and they brought her in front of Jesus? Said, Moses in the law says she's got to be stoned. What are you saying? Now the next thing that John writes is very interesting. Jesus bent down and started to write with his finger on the ground. Question. What did he write in the sand? Answer. We have no idea. If I was John, I'd have gone up immediately to see what he'd written, but it's in the sand, it's all been stuffed over. And I might have said to him later, what did you write on the sand? But maybe Jesus said you're right, no, he wouldn't be John. But that was the end of the conversation. Why does he put it down? That is a mark of an authentic piece of writing. If you don't believe me, believe this guy. You've all heard of C.S. Lewis. He's writing of this very episode when he says, as a literary historian, I'm perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I've read a great deal of legend, spent his life reading legends, and I'm quite clear they are not the same sort of thing. The art of inventing little irrelevant details to make an imaginary scene more convincing is a purely modern art. In other words, this would be J.K. Rowling stuff, but they didn't know how to do that in the 1st century. They simply either made it up completely or they wrote the truth. But they didn't add little bits to make it seem authentic. They weren't able to do that and hadn't come into their thinking. The Bible is full of these kind of details that if you look at them, demonstrates an authentic piece of writing. And then look at the question of authentic silence. In 1976, John A.T. Robinson, a liberal New Testament critic, in that is, he didn't believe the Bible was could be trusted, He wrote a book called Redating the New Testament. It sent shockwaves through the academic world, the critical academic world, because he came to the conclusion that every book of the New Testament, and he looked at every one of them in detail, had been completed before 70 AD. And one of the reasons, he said, for that was an argument that people like me have been using for years, was that it is absolutely silent on the most traumatic event in Israel in the year AD 70, when the Roman army thoroughly destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And there's not a mention of that in the Bible. Now, there's the prophecy of it. Jesus said it would be destroyed, but not one of the writers in the New Testament says, there we are, you see, Jesus was right, it's been destroyed. And Johnny T. Robinson says that's one evidence that they'd all been completed before the temple was destroyed. I'll miss over this for the sake of time, the climax of Acts, and we'll go to authentic letters. You know, one of the things that I think is thrilling about the New Testament letters, leaving the Gospels aside for a moment, is that they're full of personal details. They are not just the wise words of some sage sitting in a cave somewhere. There are 35 people named in the last chapter of his letter to the Romans chapter 16. 35 people named. Now that's very significant, because why bother to make up all these names if these people didn't live? There are all the books of the New Testament, all the letters of the New Testament dealt with specific issues. And they weren't just out of Paul's head, so that when he wrote to the Galatians, it's because they were likely to be turned away by a false gospel, and he condemns them for it. When he wrote to the Colossians, they were getting sucked into vain philosophy. When he wrote to the Thessalonians, they had a problem with what's happening to Christians who die, and when is Jesus coming again. When he wrote to the Corinthians, he was concerned for the whole question of the false doctrine and the immorality that was creeping into the church. Always a reason for the letters. And there's a lot of coming and going. You can follow people through the New Testament letters. It's almost like a storybook. If I just take one chapter, one book rather, Paul's last letter, we referred to it earlier, probably his last letter before he was martyred. These people I picked out in yellow are people he mentions that are moving around and going places and doing things. Timothy, please come and join me as soon as possible. Bring Mark and bring the cloak and that I left with Carpus at Troas. Oh, and the scrolls and the notebooks. Demas, another worker, has deserted the gospel and gone to Thessalonica. Alexander the metalworker is opposing me and doing me a lot of harm. Crescens, Titus and Tychicus have moved on to Galatia, Dalmatia and Ephesus respectively. Erastus stayed at Corinth. Trophimus was too ill to come, so he's been left at Miletus. Luke, Ebulas, Pudens, Linus and Claudius and all the brothers are still with me, and they send greetings to Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Now these are all comings and goings. You don't make this sort of stuff up. This is first century reality. And then there are the supposed contradictions. Well, I'll just give you two. There are many, but I can only really give you two for the sake of time. Take the parable of the sower. Matthew's Gospel, it says, the seeds that fell on good soil, they represent those who hear the word of God and they understand it. Mark uses a different word, and he says they are those who hear the word of God and they accept it. Luke uses a different Greek word, and he says they are those who hear the word of God and they hold it fast. Now, which one is right? Well, they all are probably right, and for these reasons. It first of all shows evidence of independence. They're not copying the same source. Secondly, sometimes, but not in this case, because there are three different words used, it's the difference in different translations into English. Translators are using a different English word to translate the same Greek word. More importantly, it is evidence of a repeated sermon. Now, I said earlier that we have about 1,000th part of the teaching of Jesus and the actions that he did. 1,000th part. Now here he is out on the mountainside, and sometimes he spent the best part of the day there. He is like any open-air preacher, or for that matter, any preacher. he is repeating himself. The same illustrations will come up and he repeats them, but they don't have to be in exactly the same words. So there's no contradiction there. He's simply repeating in different words. Sometimes it's the same sermon, the same teaching on a different occasion. So you would expect it to be different words. You cannot use that kind of thing as a contradiction in the Bible. But here's a more tricky one. Matthew speaks of 2 blind men healed as Jesus was leaving Jericho. Mark, referring to the same accounts, refers to only one, names him Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, but agrees they were leaving Jericho. Luke mentions only one, but he says he was healed as Jesus approached the city. Well now, how on earth are you going to put that together? Was he leaving? Was he approaching? Were there 2? Were there 1? Well, just before we come to that, just to make sure that you're all with me, try this one. A friend, and this is absolutely true, a friend who knows me claims when Brian moved into Surbiton, he lived at 20A Herne Road in the borough of Elmbridge, Esher, Surrey. Another friend who knows me contradicts. Oh no, Brian lives at 41 Herne Road in Kingston upon Thames, Greater London. Now how would you resolve that? They are plain contradictions, right? Any ideas?
The first one is some time ago. The current one is today.
Good, that's true. But what's happened in between? Take me the next step.
Well,
So how do you get
should be moved.
Right, so Brian moved house. Wouldn't that be the most obvious thing? Well actually, Brian's never moved house. This is true. When I moved to number 28 Herne Road, it was in the borough of Elmbridge, Esher, Surrey. Shortly after I arrived, for some peculiar reason, the houses in Herne Road were renumbered and the odds even sides were swapped. My 20A became 41. I didn't even move across the road, they moved the numbers. A few years later, believe it or not, the boundary which actually ran down my fence, I had different dustmen from the people next door. I was in Esher, which is very posh, so I used to tell people that I had dustmen with white coats. The boundary was changed and the new number 41 was absorbed into Kingston upon Thames, which is in Greater London. In other words, every single bit of that apparent contradiction was correct when we knew all the details. And the problem is, we don't know all the details in the New Testament because we only have 1,000th part of it all. So go back to the blind men. Mark knew his name and his family apparently, so he calls him Bartimaeus. The others maybe didn't know, or if they did know, didn't need to know, they didn't think it was that relevant. He was a blind man and that was the important bit. And if you've ever been there, you'll know that there is an old and a new Jericho. The old Jericho, and I've stood on the ruins of the old Jericho, is the one that was knocked about a bit in the time of Joshua, back in the Old Testament. They're still digging on it today. But right bang slap next door is where the people live, and that's the new Jericho. So what if he was moving from one to the other, out of one, leaving, into the other, approaching? Actually, Luke breaks up the record by the account of the little man up in the trees, Zacchaeus. And it looks as though part of the story might have been in the evening. Jesus went and spent the night in the home of Zacchaeus and his family, and the rest of the account of the healing took place the next day as they were moving from one part of the city into the next. If we knew all of those details, and I can't prove all of those, but they are reasonable, and if they're reasonable, they stand. Actually, the most important evidence of the reliability of the Bible comes in what you may think is the weakest part of all, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Does it matter? Well, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 actually said if Jesus didn't rise, then Christian faith is nonsense. I agree with him. And if Jesus didn't rise, we are still dead in our sin. We can't be forgiven. I agree with him. And all the promises of Jesus come to a full stop. So does it matter? You bet it does. It's the most important thing of all. So let's quickly zip through a few evidences. I want you to remember these, first of all. Got them? That these have to be taken, the documents have a right to be taken as a true record until proven otherwise. I won't run through them all. Let me come to the evidence. Evidence number one. Jesus said he would rise on the third day. You said that must be the weakest of all. Anybody can say that. The question is, did he? Yeah, but hold on a moment. The important thing is very few of his disciples believed that. In fact, none of the men disciples believed it. It's an open question whether some of the women did. So the very fact that he made the claim meant that he also, in the same context, made the claim as to how he would end up: betrayed, crucified, rise. The first two are matters of history. Evidence two. There are 4 independent Gospels all telling the same account. All telling the same story from a different angle, but telling the same story. 4 independent witnesses, remember. Not 1, 4. Evidence 3. All 4 Gospels agree that the first people to see Jesus alive were the women. So what's the deal there? Well, you have to understand that in the first century, a woman's word was not anywhere near as important as a man's word. In fact, Josephus, the Jewish historian, put it this way, if you can read it: "Let not the testimony of women be counted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." That's Josephus, it's not Brian saying that, so don't get on to me afterwards. That is how women were seen. Generally, there were exceptions, actually not just in Judea but across the empire, both in Greece and in Rome. Why would you make up the story that the women saw him first, which played in the hands of your mockers who would say, well, you expect women to say that kind of stuff, don't you? They believe anything. That's exactly what they would say. You wouldn't make it up. It's there. It's the biggest put down in the first century to men. Who would you put? Well, I could tell you who'd put. I've written a story with John and Peter saw him first. That would be the right thing to do. And remember, there are not just the 4 gospel eyewitnesses, but many others. The gospels include many other people who saw him. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 adds a whole lot more. And this is first century. You can check them out. Paul actually says many of them are still alive. And he's opening himself to somebody saying, well, check it out. Go and see them. Evidence 5, and I'm not giving you all the evidences. The Apostle Paul himself was an arrogant, ardent, anti-Christian persecutor. He tells us that. That's his own testimony. He met with Christ on the road to Damascus. He was just outside the city when he heard the voice of Christ, saw a bright light, and was dramatically converted. For that belief in the risen Jesus, he gave his life and he stopped the Roman Empire, planting churches, writing letters. He was utterly convinced that he had met with Christ. The only other evidence I'm going to give you is the evidence that it has been critically tested. I mentioned Simon Greenleaf. You can buy his book today, it's online. The testimony of the evangelists examined by the rules of evidence administered in courts of justice, 1846. That from one of America's greatest historic lawyers. Or Albert Henry Ross. Some of you may know him under his pen name of Frank Morrison. He wrote a book in the 1930s called Who Moved the Stone. He examined it with such incredible legal detail that most people thought he was a lawyer or a magistrate or something. Actually, he wasn't anything. He was a printer and a publisher and a bit of a journalist, but had a brilliant mind. In fact, G.K. Chesterton, who many of you will know of, he actually commented that he writes like a lawyer. And then more recently, I don't know whether you've seen this, Lee Strobel, an arrogant atheist who was livid when his wife became a Christian and determined as an award-winning journalist, he was going to rubbish the resurrection. And he researched it in every single detail, and it led to his Christian conversion because he was convinced that in any court of law, the resurrection of Christ would stand up. You can read the book today, you can see the film today made of it. So, the evidence demands a response, a reasoned response from all of us. And if I may say it a little bit tongue in the cheek, don't forget, even skeptics become believers. As I close, I want to point this out to you. For their faith in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, thousands upon thousands of Christians suffered persecution in the first century and do today all around the world. This is a piece of graffiti mocking Christians in the first century. I'll make it clearer for you like this. It's a donkey-headed man spread eagled on a cross. The Christians were called Asinari, the donkey people, because they believed in a criminal who had been put to death by the Romans, and they believed that he had risen from the dead. And they were mocking him. Alexamenos, it's in misspelled Greek incidentally, Alexamenos worships his god. There's a little man they're worshipping. Underneath, in perfect Latin, I suspect it could have been Alexamenos himself who crept out at night, is written, Alexamenos is faithful. You can mock, you can jeer, but yes, I know this Jesus, and I am worshipping him. One of the most moving pictures I think you'll see is this one. It's a 19th century picture by Jean-Léon Gérôme, The Christian's Last Prayer. It's a group of Christians. You can see an elder and women and children kneeling there, the animals being set up. We know this happened because Tacitus, the Roman emperor, the Roman historian, and others have mentioned this kind of thing happening. Christians were thrown, many of them, hundreds of them, to be gored by wild animals. What you haven't noticed is on each one of those stakes there is a Christian burning. Tacitus tells us that Nero poured pitch over Christians and then set them alight to illuminate his garden fires. So, what was it that made so many Christians then and all through the centuries and around the world today die for their faith? If you go to the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, you can go into a tomb which isn't the tomb Jesus was buried in, but it's very similar, and you can see where the body would have been laid. And as you turn around and come out, you'll see there's a notice on the inside of the door. He is not here, for he is risen. The resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. Or, as the Apostle Paul put it when he was writing to the Corinthians, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he was raised the third day according to the Scriptures. You've been very patient. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand straight down to John.
Steve, an authentic book. The Bible is most definitely an authentic book, but then again, so is the Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I checked up authentic to see what it might actually mean, and that's the definition. Genuine, undisputed origin, not a copy. And there's an example of its usage there. Notice that the definition does not include the word true. Authentic does not mean true. Here's some synonyms. Genuine, original, real, actual, pucker, bona fide, true. That's true. Quite a long way down the list. And if you look further down, based on facts, way down the list. Now, Brian's presentation was an attempt to add credibility to the Bible. I suspect that he would really want authentic to mean true. He said it. He's a committed Christian and he thinks the Bible is the true word of God.